There is an obstacle that I have seen every aspiring data analyst face, and the faster you can identify when you are hitting this obstacle, the faster you can overcome it and be ready for the job market. And it's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which people who have a low set of skills or ability overestimate their knowledge, and then as they continue to learn, the less that they feel that they know. And this happens all the time, where people feel that they're on top of it. You've done certifications, you watch YouTube videos, you know a lot of Excel formulas, you know how to make pivot tables, and you know how to write some SQL. But then as soon as you start a real project, let's say at a volunteering opportunity or with a real stakeholder at work, you find that all your confidence actually vanishes. And then you start asking questions like, what am I even supposed to do with this data? How come none of the things that I learned in the examples or tutorials that I was doing actually translates to what I'm seeing on the job now? So today I want to walk you through how to overcome this obstacle, and stick around to the end because I want to leave you with some practical tips that you can implement right now to accelerate your stepping over this obstacle to go from aspiring to confident to confident. If you're new here, I'm Christine. I'm a former data director and a hiring manager who now helps people take the most direct path to working in data by helping them learn how to think, speak, and operate like the top 1% of analysts who get hired. If that sounds helpful to you, make sure to subscribe and let's dive in. So let's start with what I call the ignorant peak. This is where most people begin, especially if you've been focusing on certifications, lurking on Reddit, watching YouTube tutorials, and you have some fundamental technical skills, but you keep focusing on practicing those skills. So for example, maybe say in Excel, you know how to do pivot tables, you know conditional formatting, you know some aggregation functions like sum, if statements, and or statements and date functions. And then in SQL, maybe you know how to do things like multiple joins or CTEs or subqueries, and you know how to filter using where statements and you know window functions. And maybe you've even built a dashboard in Tableau or Power BI. But this is where you might feel super confident because you haven't yet tested yourself in a real world setting, which means that you've practiced the tools, but not the actual thinking. So you haven't yet been asked questions like, what is the business application of these tools in the day-to-day job? How do I actually understand what stakeholders find most important and what insights would be helpful to them? And how do I help decide what metrics would be most important to this analysis? In this case, the tools help, but the blueprint and the experience actually matter way more. So the danger in this phase is just in staying at the peak of ignorance and continuing to do what you're comfortable with already. So continuing to do more certifications, more online classes, practicing more SQL questions on DataCamp or Udacity or Data Lemur, and building portfolio projects with no real business value. So next comes the fall into what we call the valley of oh crap. And this is usually what happens when you start on your first real project. And what I mean by real project is a portfolio project that is geared towards real business value. Maybe it's a project that you're working on at work with a live data set, or maybe it's a project that you're actually working on for a take-home test for an interview. This is where you get a data set with dates that don't make any sense and maybe don't have another source of truth, duplicate customer IDs, and you're not really sure which customers you should delete or keep, or maybe columns that don't really seem to make sense in the context of the analysis, but you're not sure if you're actually missing something. So suddenly, it's not about finishing a task. It's actually about having a structured approach, knowing a little bit of project management and organization, and knowing how to think like an analyst. But the thing is, online certifications, boot camps, blog posts, Slack communities, they don't actually teach you that. So I think what happens in this stage usually is that people realize that even though they know all the technical things, so they know how to click the buttons and make the pretty graphs, they don't know how it's actually applied in real life. This is when you start entering the transformation of a real data analyst, and you have to start asking yourself questions like, what is the actual story that I'm trying to tell with my data? What metric should I be focusing on and why? How do I clean this data in a way that doesn't lose the real insight? And how do I actually document my findings in a way that someone else actually understands? One of my current students, Audrey, said in an office hour session that even though her title in her current job is data analyst, when she started working on one of the first projects in the program, which is quite technically rigorous and also really stretches you to think about how the project is applied in a business setting, she said, even though my title at work is data analyst right now, I started to ask myself, am I even a data analyst at all? The thing is, even though she felt that she was unraveling and becoming less confident, to me, this is actually the hallmark of someone who's actually becoming more of an analyst because they're approaching data with the right level of skepticism and starting to ask the right questions. This moment feels really uncomfortable, but if you're here, it means that you're actually starting to hit the bottom of the valley of oh crap, which is actually a good thing because you can start climbing out of that valley and start building your real confidence confidence to having a taste of real analyst work. And it's not the kind of confidence that is rooted in saying, okay, I watched a bajillion tutorials on this one function before, I know how to apply this, but rather in the confidence that it says, I know that I've seen this uncertainty and this messiness before. I've figured out what questions I need to ask and how to frame this problem, and I figured it out in the past, so I know that I can figure it out again. This requires you to leave the comfort of certifications and online tutorials and asking ChatGPT to solve every question for you, and pushes you to actually start thinking your way through and coming up with your own methodology and frameworks and structured approach to answer any question you might get on the job. So here are 3 things that my students do differently to climb out of this valley, and you should too. The first one is to reframe the project goals and problems. So root your questions in company context and real business metrics. So for example, instead of I'm going to make a sales dashboard, pose the question, create a dashboard that will help the marketing team understand which channels are driving high-value customers, which social media campaigns and website referral links bring customers with the highest LTV. The second is that they actually use tools as a system. So instead of using tools one by one in a project and practicing functions taught in tutorials over and over again, they get familiar with the trade-offs of each tool. So try to do data cleaning in Excel, then also do it in SQL and understand where each one works well or not so well. And don't repeat the same functions over and over again. Try to figure out new ways of solving the same question across different tools so you can understand how these tools fit together on the day-to-day job. So for example, instead of using Excel to create pivot tables and segment data over and over again with the way that you know how, try to use a group by in SQL to create the same exact pivot table and see if you can understand the similarities and differences between these tools. They also bring their interpretation to insights instead of just reporting the facts. So for example, instead of saying something like revenue increased by 20% in the last few months of last year, they actually add their perspective by saying something like revenue increased by 20% in the last few months of last year, which is actually a lower increase than we saw in the previous year. So it's not actually necessarily a good thing. This was mostly due to the fact that iPhones did not do as well in the holiday sale compared to the previous year. So this is where you start applying your skills, the skills that you have learned in certifications and the safety of behind your computer in tutorials, and start putting them into an environment that actually mimics the real job. And that's how you start climbing out of this valley. So if you're in that valley of, oh crap, here are some steps to start moving forward. The first is to do some real projects with real messy data. So stop scrolling on Kaggle and looking for data sets there. Those data sets are often just too small, they don't contain real business metrics, or they don't have the real messiness that represents realistic data from the actual job. Instead, what you want to do is start working on projects that either use data from your current job, if you're able to access that data, any data that has to do with financial metrics, sales metrics, marketing metrics, operations metrics, any metrics that are really relevant to the industry that you're working in. Another way is to work on volunteer or freelance projects. There's a lot of volunteer opportunities for data analysts, and yes, they are still a little bit competitive, but it is much easier to get your hands on those projects than just waiting for a data analyst job. And then another way is to actually approach small businesses that could use some analyst help. The sooner that you can interact with messy data and get your hands on some of the realities of the job, then the faster you're going to start climbing out of this valley and up the slope of enlightenment. Check out my video here for more information on finding messy data to work for in portfolios, and check out my portfolio playbook series if you want to work on one of these messy data sets along with me. The second is to talk to people and start getting feedback. You'd be surprised by how much you can learn just by hearing things like, at my company, we care most about metrics like AOV and churn. So even just one coffee chat with another data analyst, someone who you have a mutual connection with, someone who you connect with on LinkedIn, how much just a 30-minute chat can give you a perspective that is 10 times more useful than any YouTube tutorial. You want to ask them questions like, what kind of metrics do you track at your company and why? What kind of challenges have you faced on your data projects and how have you navigated those challenges? Or if there was one project that I could work on that you think would be most relevant to your team or your company, what would that project be? Or if you actually have a more personal relationship with them, being able to ask something like, I built this dashboard that focuses on these metrics. If you were to take a quick look at this dashboard, what are the 1 or 2 biggest things that you would improve? Just remember that there's lots of people who would be willing to give 15 to 20 minutes of their time to just share a little bit more about their journeys, what they have learned, and their perspective on working in data. So the way to do this is usually just to send a quick message on on LinkedIn, connecting about your backgrounds, or maybe having a slightly personal note about why you're interested in hearing more about their story, and just asking for a 15 to 20-minute chat. The third is to iterate, document, and refine. So use each project as an opportunity to form a more structured, repeatable approach to every project that you get. You can ask yourself questions like, what went well, what was confusing, and what would I do differently next time? This is how you start building your own mental playbook so that you become more confident, not that you know every single answer, but that you could solve many different kinds of questions. So if you're feeling lost right now, if you feel like you know less the more that you learn, you're actually doing it right. And if you're ready to take the overwhelm out of the process and just start applying your energy to a proven roadmap, then you might be interested in my mentorship program, the Analytics Accelerator. Most of our students come in at somewhere along the peak of ignorance, and we take them through the journey of going through the valley of vocrap and guiding them up the slope of enlightenment to building that real confidence. That's all for today. I will see you guys in the next one.